Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Dude, you ready to sashay? You ready to dance?
Yes, let us dance. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to you were just mentioning something about mycosynth gardens that I'm totally fascinated by. Explain that to me. It can copy attractions. What's going on with that?
I don't know. So I've been thinking about the Mycosynth Gardens for a while. It's the new card from one. It's a land. It lets you copy a non-token artifact for X tap, and X is equal to the mana cost of the artifact you're trying to copy.
Okay.
Hold on. Excuse me. So everybody's been like, yeah, you copy Phyrexian Dreadnought for a mana, and it's great. And I'm over here being like, well, you can copy attractions for 0 mana, so that's really what I want to be doing. Because the attractions are not token artifacts; they are artifacts, and they come in, and their CMC is 0. So you can go, Deadbeat Attendant, and then Mycosynth Garden, copy whatever attraction you flip over, or you can have some fun. You can have some fun with the Mycosynth Gardens.
Okay.
Before we dive into our Mercurial Spelldancer episode, where we're going to break down a couple of deck lists and possibilities, and just talk about that card in the context of legacy decks, and how you'll share what you think. I think that it's one of those cards where it's good, but it's a trap to think that it's the new card trap to build around a card that is not a build around. And Mercurial Spelldancer, I would argue, is not a build around, but just a good card that could inform card choices within a deck rather than a build around. Anyway,
I think it's much better than that, and I'll explain why. But before we do that, let's pick out a couple cards to send off to the masses here. For those of you who don't know, if you comment on the video, I have a drawing that I do. I pick out a comment randomly, and that person will receive 2004's card from the anniversary, the calendar thing, the 30th anniversary countdown thing. So that's 2004. We're gonna do like 3 of them. Let's do let's see here. We'll do 2010 as well. 2010 got chosen, and one more. 1994. A couple people haven't responded. Let's pick out one more for our Patreon supporters. Thank you all of our Patreon supporters. We've got a 1993. That's hot. 1993.
The OG.
I think that might just be Shiv and Dragon. So 93 will go to our Patreon supporter. So a couple people haven't responded to the fact that they've won. So pretty soon, so next week I'll be putting all those back into the pile. There's a lot of them. There's like 6 or 7 of them that have to go back in. So keep an eye out. I respond to your comment and tell you to hit us up in the Discord. Join us on Discord, of course. Links below. You can find us on what's called MoxField.com, where we keep all these decks. All the links for those decks are below as well. MoxField.com is a amazing place to build decks. You can go on to MoxField.com, sign up for an account. It's free. It works on your PC. It works on your Mac. Every format is supported, even some exploratory formats. This site. I grew up with these guys, by the way. This site was one of the first sites to get pre-modern on as a supported format. So that's pretty awesome too. But without further ado, Phil, the catalyst of this episode this week is to be talking about Mercurial Spelldancer and why. Well, for me in particular, it's why I think that this card is the real deal.
Do you want to dive into your decks here?
Yeah, so let's talk. I have 2 lists, and then Phil's got one as well. The first list is the most basic version of why I like this card. I'm seeing it in Blue Red Delver. I don't want to talk about Blue Red Delver. Who wants to talk? No one. Nobody wants to talk about Blue Red Delver. Phil, do you
not only do I not want to talk about Blue Red Delver, I don't.
But also nobody wants to talk about Blue Red Delver.
Just as a reminder that any of the deck lists that we talk about, you can find them on the Eternal Durdles MoxField. So if you want to either follow along with it, or if afterwards when we're talking about it, if you want to just like see these as examples, none of that. Now, also we'll caveat: these are not like refined, tuned builds. These are ideas with theory behind them as to why it would maximize or help Mercurial Spelldancer actually be a player in meaningful ways beyond just a failed Dreadhorde Arcanist. So
exactly.
go
why I talk about Blue-Red Delver for just like a second. That card, so Mercurial Spelldancer is already starting to see play as the like Ragavan spot, aka replacement for the Delver in the Blue-Red Delver deck. So I like that, and I think that there are a lot of reasons why we should be playing this card more than maybe Delver Secrets or whatnot. Specifically, first off, I have slotted it into my blue-black Death Shadow deck, which is the most basic version of why I think this card is good. So Death Shadow is not a Delver deck by trade, but you generally play like one or two or three Delvers. Just as an early game threat to like kind of keep the balance of the game going. But I like Mercurial Spelldancer in this list for a few reasons. One, because I never really liked playing the Delver in that deck, even though it has like the deck has Delver qualities. I just rather play something that's like that's going to give me a little bit more value than Delver, and it feels like it's just not Delver's not doing enough in that deck. And then being able to use it with Death Shadow, wonderful. But you're gonna get to cast extra Thought Seizes, which is bonkers. Like imagine casting Thought Seize on your opponent for one mana and 4 life, and you get to look at your opponent's hand and him them with like a direction. To me, that's really good. Like being able to just look at your opponent's hand and be like, oh, you have the Fatty and the reanimation spell, I guess I'll just take them both.
Notably for certain cards, I mean, I've seen people trying out Snuff Out with Mercurial Spelldancer because it's a 0 mana removal spell, so it gets in unblockable, and then you just snuff out 2 creatures. Snuff Out's 4 life is part of the cost, where Thought Seize is 2 life loss is part of the effect.
Resolution, yeah.
So you would have to pay the 2 life a second time off of a Mercurial Spelldancer copy of Thought Seize, but you would not have to pay the 4 on Snuff Out because it's not actually casting the card.
Exactly. Another card that like I kind of wanted to highlight in this particular build, that is slightly weird, but like kind of can if you plan it out right, can be really good, is Predict. Phil and I were talking about Predict last night in the chat and on our Discord about like whether or not that is a good card to like double. And I think in a situation where you have Ponders and Brainstorms and you're looking and you're like, okay, I'll put these 2 back. I'll name, like I'll attack with my Spelldancer connected. Now I'll cast Predict. I know the top card of my deck is this. I get to draw 2 cards, right? And then you just get to draw 1 extra card off the top of that, but you also get a guess. So like there's a chance you're going to get the guess on that too. But if you throw a Brainstorm in between that, you're drawing 4 cards off of that 1 Predict that you cast, as long as you cast the Brainstorm to like check and figure out what you want on top of your deck. So there's that.
Yeah, when we were talking about Predict, and I have it in the list that I submitted for this episode as well. And I think that is an area that remains underexplored for the most part from Mercurial Spelldancer. Yeah. I saw people that there were just, the whole talk has just been really about like, oh, you get to double up your EI.
Yeah,
but it's
obviously.
Like, I don't know how necessarily how powerful that is outside of just like, at that point, I'd be interested in like playing regrows for my EIs. Like I'm more interested in just playing more like Mystic Sanctuary to rebuy my EI and cast it again. I get that like you save the mana, but you only get 1 land drop. So it's like if you were to play it on, if you have Mercurial Spelldancer and you get in on your turn 3 and then you EI, you're not going to want and you remove the oil, you're not going to want to like play your land first. You're going to want to play it off the EI, and then your second EI is going to have to both convert an additional 1 drop, in which case you're also tapping out again, which means that you're not going to on those types of sequences.
I have an answer for this, Phil. I have an answer for this. The answer is Baubles. So Baubles are free.
Totally, yeah, and you can play the Baubles.
That's where you have to lean into the Bauble, which is why I normally I don't think that Bauble's great in this particular deck, but because you're playing with stuff like that, I wanted to add the Baubles to show that, like, especially in a situation where you have EI, like that's how you're getting that extra advantage, is being able to play your land, play your spell, and get a Bauble off of it. So I think that's the way to do it.
And this is where I think that there might be an argument for it's not a full trap because all the cards are still good.
Yeah.
But I do think that all of the lists that I've seen that have played Mercurial Spelldancer and then tried to just put Bauble alongside it if you're not specifically on DRC, I think Baubles, the power level of Bauble is too low to be playable. So like, Bauble is good with like Emery because it's something that you can recur. It turns Emery into a Library of Alexandria.
Yeah.
With DRC and like Unholy Heat, it turns on Delirium, and then you get significantly more powerful effects than you would with those cards if you didn't have Delirium. But for decks that aren't otherwise using the artifact or the cantrip in any other meaningful way, like no other synergy other than it's just the free spell to put oil on your Spelldancer, I think you're diluting your deck, and in a way that will often happen is you will end up flooding because you're playing cards in your deck that don't do anything.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
And by that I mean like Ponder is air to it.
It's air.
But
yeah.
However, it's significant selection, right? Like 1 mana to look at potentially 4 cards versus 0 mana to look at something blind is and like the only way that you have selection is if you're pairing it with a fetch land, which means that you're not necessarily using your fetch land at an opportune time. And there are positions where like between all of your cantrips, like having to force feed a fetch is not necessarily optimal, and particularly in a list like Death Shadow, where fetch lands convert damage at instant speed to potentially protect interactions with Death Shadow. It can put you in awkward spots despite being a powerful card because it's a free cantrip. So I think that like long term, as you like start refining how you would want to build Spelldancer, I think you would find that Mishra's Bauble, at least when I was trying to put lists together, I was like, it turns out very anemic, the baubles, because they're not enabling or doing anything else.
Well, specifically for this list that doesn't need that doesn't play EI at all, so you don't really need it. But I wanted to highlight it there so that we could talk about the EI situation and why Bauble is important in those decks.
You know, like you being like when you sent me the list and I was looking at it, it threw me back to like the olden days before Modern Horizons 2, where a powerful Delirium spell people would play as Traverse the Ulvenwald.
Yeah.
And they would play their Street Wraiths, their Mishra's Baubles, a fetch land, and whatever else to get fast Delirium. So you would essentially have like Death Shadows, 5 through however many you wanted. And it was a way to like, you would load up the graveyard pretty efficiently for your Gurmag anglers, and that was a cool idea. It was just like, okay, it was like you were saying, it's like if Delver sucks because it's just generically, it's a generic 1-drop that doesn't do anything else with the rest of the deck. The people that moved over to stuff like Traverse the Ulvenwald, I was like, oh, this is creative because then it also gives you silver bullets for things that would be tough matchups, right? You can play your Collector Roof, you can play whatever, that's pretty cool. And I was like, maybe that's also a space for, with this list with Mercurial Spelldancer, where you were on Mishra's Baubles, because I was like, the stuff that you get in green when you double up can also be pretty powerful, like stuff like Abrupt Decay to hit 2 things uncounterably, or Assassin's Trophy and nuke 2 lands, and if they're not on a heavy basic build, then you just Stone Rain them twice. Like maybe there's space to go into a little bit more mid-rangey space there. But if you played Mercurial Spelldancer and then doubled up your Traverse the Ulvenwald, I mean, now you're just cooking with gas. It just found you 2 more threats. Like
one of the things I wanted to mention specifically, shout out to Joe Dyer, because we had this conversation in Discord and it stopped me from like spending half an hour telling you about how good this deck would be in Bug with adding green, because the Spelldancer has to connect first before it happens. It's not on attack. Right? It has to hit. It's unblockable, so it's going to hit. But because it has to hit, cards like Berserk are not that good because they're just not, they're blanks, right? Initially, I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be so good. I'm going to swing in with my Death Shadow as like a 6/6, and then like I'll double Berserk him, and then I realized that's not a thing. But so anyhow, so like moving away from this list, my final thoughts on this list is like, this is a place to start, and this is sort of the like, hey, we can replace Delvers here, and also Spelldancer has the unblockable ability, which is good in this initiative meta as well. And I took that thought and I moved on to the what I like to call Will's Carnival Control. So if you guys all want to take a second, we'll do the chime like you have on record, and move on to turn the page and move on to Will's Carnival Control. This is where things get spicy, Phil. This is where I think that Spelldancer is kind of at its finest as far as a build-around card. Specifically because we're playing we're playing a 4-color control deck here. that that actually can lean on a 5th color if we want to. I actually have green mana in here, so we could sideboard in some green effects if we wanted to. But so this is just like a 4-color control deck. You've got Comet, you've got Baleful Strixes, but we're playing Carnival cards, so we can bring on the games. We can bring on the attractions. So we've got DK and we've got Deadbeat Attendant to like get your attraction situation going. But because Comet Stellar Pup is in there, it can get back the Deadbeat Attendant if you're blocking with it, and continue to make more and more of those. The Spelldancer is good here because you get to play Expressive Iteration. Obviously, that's great. I decided to play 2 Tribal Flames as like whoops, take 8 or 10 damage off of that. But the card that Phil and I were really talking about that I kind of really got excited about here was Accumulated Knowledge. And I think I want to preface that with how I brought this concept up to Phil. First off, you have to have 1 Accumulated Knowledge in your graveyard to begin with. So let's say you just like casted Accumulated Knowledge at some point in the game, right? Now you're attacking with your Mercurial Spelldancer, and you're like, okay, I take off my 2 counters, and I'm going to cast Accumulated Knowledge. That is a draw 4. That is very good. Draw 4 is ridiculous, you know? That's just off the second one. If you happen to have 2 in your yard and you're attacking Spelldancer, that's draw 6, draw 8, you know, like that. To me, like, Accumulated Knowledge sits on the edge of what is like a playable Magic card to begin with. We were playing it in Miracles back in the day as just like, this is fine, I'll play this. But I think here it actually excels, and it gets to a point where like, if you can get that payoff of casting it for a second time in a game off of a Spelldancer, it's just all gravy. Like, who needs selection when you draw 4 cards?
Yeah, I think that there's some cool ideas in this list. I think the Tribal Flames to just double up on your Spelldancer, because your Spelldancer gets in for 2, and if you can Tribal Flames them for max amount, you just dome them for 10.
Yeah, that's I mean, you dome them. I actually have the fifth land type in here, so you could end up just doing 12 damage in 1 turn.
Yeah, like, I mean, this deck obviously looks like a great time. Like, there's no doubt
it does look
that.
like a blast. I don't know how good it will be exactly, but like, it looks like a lot of fun. I think this is the kind of thing where if I'm playing this, I'm showing up in clown makeup to the event.
Yeah. No,
like,
what else?
I need to let people know that this is how the day is going for them. You know, like, because I'm gonna have all the this deck plays 10 attractions. You know, like, you're just like. Ugh.
Yeah, I think that the actual powerful interaction, like, if this deck was iterated on over a longer period of time, I feel as though Spelldancer plus Tribal Flames and similar effects like that, where Mercurial Spelldancer is doing things similar to what you did when you played Infect, right? Where you're like, I just want to attack and get you dead, and every single attack threatens lethal. I think if you can do that with Mercurial Spelldancer and the big chunky burn spells, because you can also get in positions where since Mercurial Spelldancer doesn't have a mana gate on it, and it doesn't care about the sizing of the spell, you could go like Mercurial, like in your blue-red burn-esque deck, you can what remind me the burn spell that's sacks 2 mountains, deal 4.
That is Fire Blast.
Fire Blast. So you can play like the big chunky spells and get in for 2, Fire Blast, sacking 2 mountains, dome them.
Yeah,
and that's
for 8.
10. Yeah. And that's 10 that turn. And so if you just load up on effects that do similar things like that, and then if they're spending their
you're talking about Flame Rift. Flame Rift is a classic.
I was talking about Flame Rift, just like the big stuff that it's like, because one of the advantages of what Spelldancer is like, it doesn't work with pump spells, but it does get in for damage, you know, and that's not nothing. And there's a lot of deal 4 effects that if you double up on them, make Mercurial Spelldancer effectively a 2-turn clock if it remains undisrupted. Because if you know it's going to get in for 2 every time, and then you play 1 deal 4, it doubles up. And so if you play, and then the first one will put an oil counter on it to keep it going. So if you were to Mercurial Spelldancer, and it's oiled up, and you fire off a 4 damage spell, that's 8+2, and then the follow up is 8+2, and you might not even need all that much if players are taking damage themselves.
To the uninitiated too, because upon initially looking at Spelldancer, we were like, this might be good, but it's a little slow, I think. And I think the thing that people have now realized is the math of Spelldancer kind of lines up with itself really well, and how like needing to take off 2 is actually not that big of a deal now. So I think it's really important to kind of like highlight how like initially it looked like it was gonna be like a 3-turn situation. Now it's like every turn. You know, like you're gonna be, especially if you're drawing more spells, like you're basically going to untap, attack, and like double, like fork a spell every time.
Yeah, I think that there is something to be said about the unblockability, like not being able to be blocked, and looking at that as like one of the biggest relevant lines of text on this card beyond like it being the thing that you have to do. Like just having a playable, unblockable creature is a big game for other certain types of spells. So everybody was on Expressive Iteration, and we were talking in our Discord. Everybody joined our Discord, and there was the suggestion of what's the spectacle card?
Oh, light up the stage. Yeah,
light up the stage. So Mercurial Spelldancer is going to get in,
light up the stage,
and then you cast it for 1 mana and flip over 4 cards. And if you're just doing that, let's say in those 4 cards, if you flip over another light up the stage, I mean, they are in a pretty hard spot to have, like, they have to kill the Spelldancer at that point, because they can't let you do it again.
Yeah.
And even then, even if you don't, you can still cast it for its divination effect. So it's like, you have those ways to, like, really churn it as an engine. But that it is on the assumption, like, all of the stuff that we talked about so far, for the most part, it's not really hard protecting the Spelldancer. And I think that's a critical part of the card and its analysis is, I don't think Spelldancer, because it is so fragile, is a 2/1 that doesn't do anything when it ETBs. I don't think that can be the build around, because if it is, you have to play more protection for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know? That's kind of where this deck, it doesn't so much build around it. Like, everything in this deck is fine by itself, but like Spelldancer is just like the extra push. I feel like a deck like this kind of needs to like be a little bit more competitive and playable. You know, basically you're just doing, like, you know, we often talk about the legacy power level thing, and I think in this deck the legacy power level thing to do is forking your spells.
Yeah, it's just a matter of, are the spells that you're looking to fork playable by themselves?
Exactly.
Because if they aren't playable on their own, then you're just going to be sitting with unplayables in your hand when your deck's not doing the thing.
Which is why I did not include Temporal Trespass, which everybody seems to be like really high on right now.
Yeah, it's like one of those things. The thing is that, like, when you're taking your extra turn, it's like if you're Mercurial, it puts you in the same spot, right? Because, like, let's say you take 2 extra turns, your deck still needs to do a powerful thing. Because even with the Mercurial Spelldancer on the table, it's threatening to deal 4 more damage. And then it's like, if you only draw, like, if you just reload, right? Like, if you just cast a couple more, like, fork your cantrips, and then your opponent, and then pass the turn. In those types of decks, if you have to load up your yard, you're probably not playing significantly to the board. And if you're not playing significantly to the board, and you're not playing other spells that generate a tremendous amount of advantage, the time walks aren't really going to do much, because every single turn is going to
exactly. If you're just time walking to attack for 2 more and drop a land, like, who cares?
It's not quite it, right? Like, you would need a way. Like, the powerful thing about time walks is if you can loop them indefinitely, and there's only so many ways to do that, and they're all clunky and unplayable. So
So that's the so, you know, when we were talking about this episode initially, I was saying to Phil, we have 3 angles for what Spelldancer is. So we've got I've replaced Delver with Spelldancer, right? Then I have the, like, here's a deck. This is like, let's show off how good one spell can be if we double it off of Spelldancer. So that's Accumulated Knowledge or Tribal Flames, right? And then we have Phil's deck. You know, we'll do the chime. But yeah, so now we look at Phil's deck, which I think is a little more traditional style of control deck that basically, like, it's miracles without the miracles, right?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Yeah,
so
please.
I mean, my tendency is, you know, I'm a Tundra bro, right? Like, I can never really get away from just wanting to play all the cantrips. The thing is that when I was thinking about Mercurial Spelldancer and I was really getting into it, and I was like, okay, yeah, you know, maybe you want to double up your Hymn to Turok, that's kind of cool. I was thinking, like, I was like, what is the closest analog that we already had to Mercurial Spelldancer? And I was like, in my view, it was probably Seagate Stormcaller. And so I was looking at things that Seagate Stormcaller was really good at copying. So it's like your Cabal therapies, because with Mercurial Spelldancer, if you copy a Cabal therapy, the copy goes on the stack so you can name something. You'll see their hand, and then by the time the original resolves, you'll clip whatever you want. And then if they have something even more significant, you can always sack the Spelldancer to copy it a third time and effectively mind twist them for what would be your 2 cards, right? You play the Spelldancer plus the Cabal therapy. But that was a trick that when Seagate Stormcaller was first spoiled, I did that as well, where Seagate Stormcaller comes down, you copy your Cabal therapy, or if it's already in the yard, you ETB and sack it and get 2 copies of Cabal therapy. So it was a really good way of just like stripping their hand down to nothing and then setting up whatever else you wanted to do, which in that case with Seagate Stormcaller was Dark Rituals or Culling the Weeks or whatever. That way you could pump out like Bolus the Citadel or Peer into the Abyss, or, you know, you were doubling up on the rituals but as a way where it was bridging the gap between your disruption pieces as additional disruption, but then also as additional rituals. So that's that. If we talk about concepting and deck building, that it's like, well, it was the bridging of the gap, right? The thing that was tying my rituals to my disruption and payoffs was this piece in between. And it's a lot of times in control decks where if you see like a heavy Snapcaster control list, a lot of times the control decks are trying to line up their removal and their fair cards against other fair decks, and then their blue spells against the unfair decks where their removal is dead. And so you'd have your cantrips that kind of fill out the gap for you, but then you need a high enough density of both, and Snapcaster can play both roles as like additional copies of Flusterstorm or additional copies of Swords of Plowshares. Granted, it's more expensive, but it can also get in for 2. But that was the reason why Snapcaster had a legacy and legacy, was because it was able to bridge the gap at both sides. So it was a very flexible spell in that regard. And I think that when thinking about deck building and cohesion, you know, decks are going to end after you've seen your top 12 cards, right? Unless you're doing broken things, you're going to open your top 7. Games are going to go about 5 or 6 turns, given the speed at most, unless you're playing a very long, grindy control mirror where you're both drawing your decks. So making sure that your decks are consistent enough to be able to do the thing that it wants to do every time within the top 12 cards means that you need a high enough percentage of redundancy. And if you're playing a bunch of tools that don't have a good deck building structure to them, then you are going to end up with hands that either don't do anything, stuff where the pieces don't come together, or you're going to be like, oh, I just needed to draw my one thing. If I just drew the thing, and it's like, well, I mean, that's a deck building. Like that's not a you didn't draw it issue. That's a deck building problem, right? Like you missed the beat in deck building. If it wasn't variance, right? If your deck building was actually correct, then it wasn't a variance issue. Then there was probably something you could have done before the game started. So I'll talk about this. I'll talk about where I informed my choices for Spelldancer. So I have this deck with Spelldancer, and it's pretty much a blue-white deck that's circling similarly like we talked about around Predict. And then when we were talking about Predict with Spelldancer, we were like, yeah, you can name one, and then you get one card, but then you only just draw a second card, and you're 2-mana draw 3 after you've already invested your Mercurial Spelldancer and spells. It's like, it didn't feel like a strong enough payoff to me. But I was like, maybe there are the tools that are there to make sure that you could know the top of either player's deck for the second copy as it comes off the stack. So,
and that's where we go.
So that's where we go. So I say if the legacy power level thing in this deck in particular, in my mind, is Predict. I'm assuming the position.
Let's assume that it's Predict.
my 2-mana instant speed draw 2 is the legacy power level thing to do. Whether we agree with that or not,
like, follow and subscribe for more, everyone.
the concept of the deck is, that's the thing. It may not be true, right? Like, it may not actually be a legacy power level thing. But for the sake of this study here, I'm assuming the position that Predict is the legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, I want to make sure that most of my cards can try and maximize that. And so we have, obviously, our cantrip suite. And we also have 4 Portent. And something that works with Portent off of the Spelldancer is Portent on the second copy can target them. So you can actually set up both players' decks
that's pretty
off
good,
of a Mercurial Spelldancer. And so if you're in a position where you can fight over the cards and Spelldancer is getting in, and you can stack their deck to make sure that your Mercurial Spelldancer will continue to untap, then when you Predict, if they don't have ways to manipulate the top of their library, then you can name on something with yours, you can name something on theirs, and then you're staying on high volume cards, and you're able to keep this engine going while you then follow up with your Triumph of St. Catherine's and Mentors to actually close the door faster while you're doing that. The other card that I've been experimenting with, I have a love-hate relationship with Prismatic Ending. I hate that Prismatic Ending is at sorcery speed, and I hate that my opponents sometimes can just not agree that it's a good card. So when I play against Initiative, it sucks. When I play against any kind of control deck, it sucks. When I'm playing against like the 8-cast decks, it's good against exactly and only Chalice of the Void.
Chalice of the Void. And we side them out.
That's it.
And we immediately take them out. As soon as we see Prismatic Ending, we're like, we just don't need this card. Like, let's make everything in the deck cost 6.
When my opponents play a 3-drop, get whatever value from that 3-drop is, and then I untap and have to spend my 3 mana just playing a Vindicate, and it sucks.
Yeah,
it feels so bad, and I never win those games. You never win those games. Like the play pattern of they get the value off their thing, and then you spend your whole turn removing it. It is not a playable card. Like that sequence is not playable. It is excellent when it's a 1-mana Sword Plowshares. Like when it's clipping clipping the Grindstone or something, it's excellent, right? Fantastic. That's exactly the kind of thing you want it. But that
you say all that
ceiling,
to say this.
That ceiling drops off significantly. Anything over 2 mana that's critical, that Prismatic Ending needs to you're hinging on Prismatic Ending to unload for you. Terrible. For
the record, Phil, if you were to say double it with Mercurial Spelldancer, how would you feel about it?
The thing is if you double it with Mercurial Spelldancer, it's your whole turn, and they have to have the board.
They need to have 2 things for you to want to get rid of course, yeah.
And that works like that feels a little bit less bad with Snuff Out because Snuff Out is free, so you can clip both their creatures and then do the other stuff that you wanted to do. Whereas Prismatic Ending will just be your whole turn. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I'm not really interested in that. And also, it doesn't really work with what the game plan is. It's just a generic removal spell, and Source to Plowshares is just better. It's the best removal spell there is. So I leaned on Unexpectedly Absent because if I actually want to spend my turn...
to go right back to your point, what is the legacy power level thing to be doing?
Right. It supports Predict. And the difference, though, is that in that sequence, like let's say Spelldancer gets in, and instead of playing a card advantage spell, you need to play a board control spell that either Swords to Plowshares doubling up, or if they have a split, like they have a creature and a non-creature permanent, or they're just on non-creature permanents altogether, Unexpectedly Absent being able to tuck 2 things on top can actually steal their draws, right? It can still draw
it also like technically casts for 1 extra for the second one, right? Or for the first one, I guess.
Well,
because
the fact that it removes
put something on top and then put something on top of it. So
on top of that,
you've put 1 thing 2 down instead of 1 down.
Right, and the thing is that like I can tell you from playing a lot of these kinds of Predict Miracles control decks that it's something where it's not something that you would be able to pull off without a decent amount of practice, because not only are you maintaining like position and timing of your hand and the board, but you're also maintaining where the sequences of cards on top of your deck and sequencing of cards on top of your opponent's deck. And so it's just a lot of tracking to keep in your head at all times. And it's like if you've had millions of reps with Sensei's Divining Top, it gets a little bit easier because those, there's no better magic in the world than top miracle mirrors where both players were on 4 Predict. What a magical time that was. I love that. But
that is the Big Lebowski. There are a lot of interested parties. Everybody's.
The thing about it though is that timing is extremely tricky for all this. Yeah. And but like Unexpectedly Absent is both good when you're firing off on your opponent's stuff after you've Mercurial Spelldancer, but it's also good in a position of protecting your own stuff from removal in the case that happens. So like I have tucked my Snapcaster Mage on top of my deck to rebuy whatever else on the following turn when that's what matters all the time. That sequence comes up all the time. Yeah. So that is where so you'll see like Ponder, Brainstorm, Portent, Unexpectedly Absent, all these cards, Mystic Sanctuary, all these cards enable Predict. And then Predict is also just going to be incidentally good against other opponents with their Mystic Sanctuaries, or if they show you something from Delver or whatever. The other card that is informed in this deck is I'm only playing 18 lands in this deck, which is really light. It's a lot lighter than I normally play.
Pretty low, yeah.
And I did it because I'm on. It's a 3 days deck. I hate days, but
I noticed that you were playing days with your Mystic Sanctuary.
Yeah. I mean, I do hate days a lot, but it's where I would start with a baseline here. But the additional part of informed decisions from Spelldancer is Spelldancer does not want you to hit land drops, but it does not want you to flood. because theoretically you should be able to double up on your card advantage effects, like it doubling up on your cantrips or whatever, should make it so that you should be able to run smooth. And a lot of times if you're playing out all of your stuff and then just find that you get glutted with a bunch of lands and can't do anything, you're just going to flood out even when your deck did stuff.
Yeah.
And so as a way to lighten the load on that is I'm playing a singular Tithe, which is another spell that is effectively a land, right?
Let's read Tithe real fast, Phil, because I think a lot of people don't know what Tithe does.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so it's search your library for a Plains card. If you control fewer lands than target opponent, you may search your library for an additional Plains card. Reveal those cards to all players, then put them into your hand, then shuffle your library afterwards. So what you're saying is, if I have less lands than you, I get 2 lands. If I have less lands than you in Mercurial Spelldancer, I get 4 lands.
So you can tutor out all 4 lands if you have less in that position. But it's really like I'm not thinking of Tithe as a card that I want to double. I'm thinking of sure. This is where I was talking about in the bauble slot, right? Like the thing that would normally go in the bauble slot in a deck that otherwise isn't taking advantage of bauble in any meaningful way.
Correct.
Where this is the card that I want to play to get my Oro counters.
Yeah, I like that.
But at the same time, it's not that Tithe is a good card. I'm saying that Tithe, I would argue, is a reasonable card that is playing a very specific role that is informed by what I expect the Spelldancer to do. So in testing, it would be a card that I would have my eye on as, is it doing the thing that I want it to do, which is to ensure that I hit my land drops so that I can continue, so that way I don't get stuck doing the stuff I want to do with Spelldancer, while also ensuring that Spelldancer is continuously live. And by doing so, it means that I effectively get to trim a land, and then my deck is a little bit denser on action. So I'm not saying that like Tithe is like obviously a card that you would have to play. I'm saying that Tithe is really my 19th land, but I am rewarded for playing more spells because of what Spelldancer wants. And then similarly on that regard, I'm rewarded to play more spells because that's what Monastery Mentor wants. So having a higher density of spells without necessarily cutting too hard on lands is an informed deck choice by the Spelldancer. And I think that that's where anybody who's coming up with their Spelldancer brews, beyond just like, I want to double up this powerful thing and maybe it's good enough, is look at the cards that are otherwise already reasonable and then see if the Spelldancer can help capitalize on making them more playable than they would be without the Spelldancer.
I think one of the reasons why I like these episodes is because in talking to you about this stuff after we build the decks and whatnot, I kind of come across like sort of an epiphany myself. So what you were saying before is about how you want to be able to protect the Spelldancer with interaction and whatnot. And it's funny that like the Spelldancer lives in a weird zone where like it wants you to have proactive spells to cast, like to double up on and cast. And it's fine, like you can protect your spells, you can stifle if you want to, you can daze. But those aren't the spells you're trying to double, you know? And so you have to live in this zone, especially if you're making it your game plan, right? Where you have stuff like Portent, Ponder, Tithe is technically proactive. But you still need your dazes and your force of wills in there, and they do help. They do like add the oil counter and whatnot. But it makes you live in this weird zone to deck build with, you know.
I think that Mercurial Spelldancer kind of informs that shit like Flusterstorm or Minor Misstep or any of your counter spells or protection that costs mana is already a non-starter.
Yeah,
because it's asking you to play spells, and then it wants you to cast. It only lets you do it on your turn after you in your second main phase. And if you're spending your mana if you're porting yourself by not casting spells out of fear that your opponent can interact with you by getting rid of your Spelldancer, you're going to be hindering yourself a lot more than you're going to be hindering your opponent. Yeah. Because if you're not spending that mana, then you're not going to be using your tools effectively in a way that Spelldancer is going to be able to capitalize on. So I think that like if you're seeing lists where Mercurial Spelldancer has like the very reactive spells that cost mana that you can't actually use in a second main phase situation to double, you're going to come up in situations where you're going to have a Spelldancer.
It's the same as drawing a land in that situation.
You will have oiled it up and gotten in and then not have anything to do. And that's going to feel bad.
You're just slippery dick with nothing to do, No.
When you're slippery dick with nothing to do, that's going to be where you're going to come to the conclusions where you're like, oh yeah, this is a Dreadheart Arcanist. This actually sucks. Yeah. And it's like, well, no, I mean, Dreadheart Arcanist was annoying because it didn't really ask much of you other than to have a graveyard with stuff in it. And even then, if you didn't have the stuff in it, Dreadheart Arcanist sucked, right? But it's like Dreadheart Arcanist didn't ask really much of you in deck building. It just asked that you had access to a graveyard. Whereas Mercurial Spelldancer is a little bit more of a challenge. It's a more interesting card because you actually do need to think about what are the positions where my cards are going to be good, even if I'm not casting them in the second main phase. And things like Unexpectedly Absent are that example, right? Yeah. And it's possible that I didn't even go far. It's possible that I'm even too conservative in this deck because I can't let go of my miracles and I had to play Triumphs. And they're like, that's just actually not the best way to go. Like maybe there is a world where it's like the middle ground between us both, where it's like, yeah, we can play the baubles and we want baubles and pedals and we want to be lower to the ground and faster like that. And then Mentor rewards you for that shit. And then Mercurial Spelldancer rewards you for that shit. And then we're just like turboing that shit instead.
Just don't chuck it into 8 cast. It's not going to work. You're just going to...
Not going to work.
You're just going to cast Thought Cast 2 times.
Mercurial Spelldancer cares about instant and sorceries.
You need to have instants and sorceries in your deck,
So yeah, I think that like if you imagine the sequence of you go turn 2 Spelldancer, your opponent tries to kill it, you catch it with a counter spell, it now has an oil counter, you untap, you cantrip, you puts the second oil counter, you find your portent, you attack them, you check it, you portent yourself, you portent them, you've drawn the 2 cards off of that portent because you draw, both will resolve in the next upkeep, and then you are now set up to like, you've stacked their deck, you're now loaded up, like it's more meaningful. Like the cards are actually powered up by Spelldancer existing in your deck rather than like, oh, it's just additional copies of my Expressive Iteration, and it's like you're already winning if you're playing Expressive Iteration.
Exactly. Like, so I guess this is a good place to kind of cut off, but I did want to tackle back 1 second because I didn't talk about the other like legacy, like weird, like kind of power level type of thing that the Carnival deck was doing. I didn't actually talk about Will. The deck is named after Will, so being able to roll choose the higher of the 2 dice means that you're going to roll 6s more often. And that means that you can almost kind of like weirdly not go infinite, but like you're going to get a lot of activations off of your what's called all of the attractions. I believe are on 6, right? Like every one of them.
I am invested in your pursuit to make the next
Will work.
Playable. To make the next legacy playable combo deck is just 4 Will, 4 Comet, and then you roll, and then you just go infinite with Comet and kill them.
There's also a card, Pixie Infiltrator or something like that. I'll put it up here. Pixie something that does that, but you don't have to choose the highest number, which is interesting. So having like a bunch of those out. I think also Barbarian class.
Bamboozling Beeble does that, bro.
There you go. But yeah, so the die rolling thing is just like a fun like thing to me, and like just having like that. Look, you're never going to be at the top tables with that situation, I don't think. But man, you're going to have so much fun.
I'm gonna make.
I have clown dice, guys. I have clown dice. Like,
I'm gonna make my one suggestion for your Tribal Flames deck.
Sure.
Please swap the Wastelands for literally anything else.
Yeah. I know. I'm looking at that. And I'm like, ugh.
Yeah. Wasteland's good, but Wasteland in your Tribal Flames deck is a little iffy.
It's rough. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's it for us this week. Like I said, I'm gonna get those in the mail. Please like, comment, subscribe if you can. It means almost nothing to you, but it means so much to us. We're on that like goal to get to 1,000 people, 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, and then YouTube like rewards us or something. We had like the last like couple episodes have been amazing. Thank you everyone for commenting, folks in our Discord. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with us about the game in Discord.
I'll give a little preview. Of another episode that we're going to do in terms of deck building theory with a really cool example. So I'll tease it now, and then we'll dive into it on either the next episode or the episode after. And I got permission to. One of the guys at Game Storia, the local shop that I play at every week, his name is Andrew Ahern, and he is a brewer. He's a brewer through and through. He and I talk about deck lists and ideas for different things all of the time. The thing is that we both are we like to look at things a little bit from a different perspective, because I'm a Tundra mage who likes to do nothing until you concede, right? And he is a guy who he runs the gambit. I've seen him play everything, and I've seen him play Merit Lages. I've seen him try Delvers. I've seen, he's always experimenting with stuff, and he's very creative. And he showed me a deck list that had the most creative use for Mycosynth Gardens that I've seen since the card was spoiled. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to tease what the idea is, and then we'll delve into it for a full episode. Because
we're going to make some Mycosynth Garden decks next week.
It is a prime example of it was just like the ideal situation for deck building theory. And we debated it after the shop, on ideas of which way we could go with it. And it was really, really compelling. So the idea of this deck is you play the Mycosynth Gardens with Dark Depths. Well, how are you supposed to copy Dark Depths with your Mycosynth Gardens? Well, you copy it with Liquid Metal Coating.
Liquid Metal Coating?
So you turn your Dark Depths into an artifact, and then you copy it for 0 mana, and it effectively becomes another Thespian stage. But you're like, well, Liquid Metal Coating sucks. Why would I play that in my deck? What am I going to do with that? Well, he was also on 4 Karn.
Karn, yeah, there you go.
And Karn makes it so that if your plan of trying to just churn out a fast 20/20 doesn't work, you can start nuking their lands in a way that Karn has always done, and then you're playing your Ancient Tombs in fast mana and doing all this anyway. And I was looking at it. So he showed me the deck list, and he was like, what do you think about this? And I said, anytime I see a deck list that has all of these Liquid Metal Coatings, I'm like, it just doesn't do anything without the Karn. And I'm like, what else is going on? And he's like, look at the Garden plus Dark Depths, my guy. And it was one of those, the gif of the guy with all the stars around his head. And I was just like, because the second that he said that, I recognized the ABC deck building theory that was applied here, whether or not he realized how effective that was or not. Yeah. Because you're like, well, if I want Gardens plus Dark Depths is the powerful level thing to do. Therefore, I need the Dark Depths to be an artifact, which is Liquid Metal Coating. Therefore, I want Karn as a way to balance. So it's literally you have your ABC deck building.
Phil, let's not spoil the whole episode here.
We're not going to spoil. Okay, so but we'll get into it next time. We'll talk. We'll actually have a deck list for it, and I'll talk to him about it further. But it was the coolest idea that I've seen for Mycosynth Gardens so far. And the thing about it is also means that when we have our Mycosynth Gardens episode, there's the well of how deep Mycosynth Gardens can actually go. Because I thought it was you have Amulet in Modern, and you have your Phyrexian Dreadnought sometimes in Legacy. And then he was like, dude, Liquid Metal Coating. And I was like, I never would have got there.
Well, yeah, like I said, that's it for us this week. Hey, don't forget to hit up our store for the What It Do merch and the Side of It Inbox merch, and obviously just the Eternal Durdles merch. Please remember, subscribe, all that stuff. Really appreciate it. Patreon, thank you so much, Patreon supporters. If you want to get on that, you can support us at patreon.com/EternalDurdles. And that's it for this week. Everybody have a great week. We will see you on the next one.
Hey, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out this other video, and if you can, please support us on patreon.com.